So welcome back to another tutorial. Today we're going to paint a maple leaf, and I took this reference photo when I took the reference photo for the red leaves that I painted the other day. So I'm going to start off this sketch right on my watercolor paper, looking at the reference photo. And a lot of the time what I like to do is look at the negative space. So pay more attention to the actual space around the leaf, and that will help you to better position it on your page as well. So I'm just kind of looking at this and figuring out about how far down the page I want to go, where it's going to end, and where the top of the leaf will be. And once I have those points marked in with my pencil, then I can start actually sketching the shape and the details of the leaves. And probably my best advice whenever you're sketching something is you always want to start off with the larger shapes first and then work your way down into the details. And this sketch really isn't going to be that detailed. I just want the basic outline, and I also want the shadow shape that's in there. But as far as marking anything out within the leaf, I'll make some indications where the veins are. And the only reason that I'm doing that is because in this tutorial, we're going to use masking fluid. And I have never really been a huge fan of masking fluid. And I think the reason for that is I really don't care for the hard edges that it leaves. You always have to go back in and rework those edges and try to soften them out. At least I do. And I find that I prefer actually painting around things instead of using masking fluid. But I have used masking fluid in my last few paintings and it's worked out okay. So I thought we'd give it a shot here. So I'm going to speed this up and you can watch me lay this leaf onto the paper. And I will provide the reference photo that I took and also the line drawing, and those will be posted in the description below. So you can just print out the leaf sketch, the line drawing, and you can transfer that right onto your watercolor paper by scribbling on the back side with graphite, laying it on top of your watercolor paper, and then tracing over, and that will transfer the leaf shape onto your paper. So it's super easy, and then you can get right into the painting part of it. So I'm just going in here and I'm cleaning up some of these edges and adding in this shadow shape, and I'm trying to be as precise as I can, although nobody's going to hold up my reference photo against my painting, so we don't have to be too picky. I just want to make sure that I get some of these fun little details, like the tip of the leaf where it flips over, because that's captured in the shadow. And it's those little details that I really love. So I'm pretty happy with that. And we're going to move on to mixing up our first wash. And I'm using this new Gamboge. And this is a Daniel Smith color. I've got a couple of different brands in this palette. I think the Cad Orange that I'm adding into this, I believe it's a Winsor & Newton, I'm not sure. But I'm just making up a nice light puddle. I want this to be warm. It's going to be a light layer that we're going to lay down. This is the layer that will be showing through as the veins. So we don't want to go too dark. You never want to go too dark with your first layer because we work from light to dark in watercolor. So you're going to see I'm working, you know, wet on dry paper. And I've got a pretty soupy mixture. And I'm using this quill brush by Davinci. And I think this is a number 4. And I like these because they hold quite a bit of water and paint, and you don't have to reload quite as often. And I'm just getting this paint in here, and I'm being very, very careful along the edges of the leaf And you can see right there I go in and paint the shadow. So later on I go and scrub that out. I edited that out so you wouldn't have to watch me scrub it out, but I have a tendency to paint right into my shadow areas. I get so caught up in the moment. So I'm just getting this filled in with a nice flat wash, and you can see these inside the veins there. It's really a light orange, yellow. It's a warm color. So really any light warm color will work. You could even probably use red. And I'm just being really careful around these edges. And I have the habit of trying to work, you know, quickly so my edges don't dry. And in this first wash, it's really not that important if you have a hard edge, or if you have let's say you have a bloom, because we'll be painting over this initial wash anyway. So I think the most important step, or the most important thing with this first wash, is to get the edges nice and clean. And once this layer is dry, then we'll go in and add our masking fluid on top of this to mask out those veins. And you can see that the veining in the leaf, there's some very prominent veins, and all of the not so prominent veins I just left alone. I wasn't gonna go in and get super detailed with the masking fluid. So I'm going to go and pick up some of this Scarlet Red. I think it's a Scarlet Red or a Cad Red. And I'm going to drop in some red color inside, in the middle of that leaf where you can see some of that red. And this is a good opportunity to kind of map out where your colors are going to be. You can use this stage as a reference for yourself, kind of. If you want to add in some shadow areas in a darker color, you can do that. And I'm looking at this and I'm realizing that I've kind of gone over some of my veining, and I'm just going to dry my brush off, rinse it, kind of dry it off, and pull some of that paint away from those veins. And I pulled a little bit too much of the color out, so I just dropped it back in. And then I dried it with a dryer, and I'm using this Pebeo drawing gum. And I have this little rubber shaper tool, and I thought it would be kind of fun to try this out instead of using a brush. And I'm not a fan. I think I would have been better off with a brush. Even though this has a nice edge to it, you have to constantly reload, and it seemed to dry really quickly on the tip. And it kind of dragged on the paper too. I didn't really like the way that it felt. So that's just a personal preference. I know there are a lot of people out there that like using these rubber shaper tools for their masking fluid. And maybe with some more practice I would like it better, but I feel like I should have just stuck with a brush. And I think the veining on here, it got too thick too. I really didn't like how thick this went on. The lines weren't very fine, but I stuck with it just to see what would happen. And now we have to let this dry naturally. Please don't ever dry masking fluid with a heat gun, or you'll never get it off. All that does is set it on the paper. So I have let this dry, and I've come back, and I'm going to go back through here, and I'm going to very carefully re-wet the entire surface of this leaf. And this is really the fun part, where we get to drop in paint color, wet in wet. And leaves are really fun because you can really stray from the reference photo and kind of do your own thing. So make sure you've got a nice glaze of water, no standing puddles. And I'm mixing up some of this burnt sienna. And to darken it up, I add a little bit of the ultramarine blue into this. And I'm just looking for a deeper brown. I'm not sure actually if I added imperial purple into there or an ultramarine blue. Maybe it was a Paynes Gray. And I'm mixing up some more of this Cad Orange just to get some puddles going. And I've got a separate puddle of burnt sienna going next to the Cad Orange. And this is the fun part, like I said. So we can go in here and pick up a really dark color, and I'm going to start concentrating this color along the tips of the leaves where I see the really dark brown, and along a lot of these edges too. And because we have our masking fluid down and it's dried, we can paint right over the veining and we don't have to worry about losing our the light lines of the veins, which is the nice thing about masking fluid. If I had not used it, then I would probably be painting this very like in sections like I did the last tutorial, so that it would be easier to avoid the veins. And I think I actually prefer that method, but like I said, it's totally a personal preference. So I'm going to be quiet here for a little bit and I'll just let you watch, and I'll come back once we move on to the next section. So now that I have all of these dark areas established, some of the areas are shadows and some of them are just the local color of the leaf. So I'm going back in and I am picking up some of this really concentrated pigment, and my paper is damp, so I still have the opportunity to lay in some color, and the paint won't dry with a hard edge. It'll all just kind of blend into each other at this stage. And I really want to accentuate that deep dark red that we see in the middle of this maple leaf. And don't be afraid to go really dark here. I shouldn't say dark, but don't be afraid to go with really saturated pigment. So you don't have a lot of water in your brush, you have just mostly pigment, and this will dry lighter. So watercolor always dries lighter, so you can afford to push the saturation of the color a little bit. And I'm just dropping in some areas of texture to make it a little more interesting, darkening up some of the tips, taking a drink of coffee. And now I'm going to add in the stem, and I've got a kind of red color on my brush, and I have my masking tape at the bottom right butted up against the edge of that stem, so I'll have to finish that off once the tape is removed. But I'm grabbing a little bit of a darker color and just running it along the bottom edge of that stem, just to create a little bit of dimension. And as I'm looking at this, I am noticing that I don't want to just walk away and let it dry. I'm going to take advantage of painting in the shadow area. I think my edges are dry enough, and you can see that I accidentally forgot to start filming, and I already put in a little bit of color there at the top for the shadow. And now I'm just going to go in and pick up some of this graphite. I don't want it to be too dark. I don't want to be able to see it through the shadow that I'm painting. So for the shadow, I am using some Ultramarine Blue and very carefully going in and adding this shadow along the edges. Now, shadows are typically darker next to the object, and then they kind of fade off. But in the reference photo, which I'll put up here in just a second, in the reference photo, you'll notice that the cast shadow from this leaf, it's actually pretty uniform. And there aren't a lot of areas where it fades off into a lighter value. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to paint a flat wash in this color and being very careful not to let the edge dry. So I've got to work kind of quick. I will be dropping in some burnt sienna just because it's a little bit of reflected color into the cast shadow. And it makes the shadow more interesting too. So I'm being really careful around these edges. They're probably still just a little bit damp. And I don't want my blue to bleed into the leaf. And there's the cast shadow, and you can see that it's pretty uniform. I mean, there is a slight darker value under the leaf that's closest to the edge, but it's, to my eye, very slight. And there are also some darker areas that are created from this reflected light, which is brown, which I'm dropping in the burnt sienna to kind of mimic that. And just make sure that when you're painting your cast shadow and you're dropping in other color, make sure that area is still plenty wet. And I'm just trying to be really careful with these edges. I'm trying to be as precise as I can and working quickly enough so that edge doesn't dry. And you can see there towards the bottom of that cast shadow, there's a blue dot, and that's actually masking fluid. And in the cast shadow, you can see that there is a hole in the leaf, and that's, you can really see that in the cast shadow, not so much in the leaf, but I wanted to capture that, so I put a little masking fluid down there to save the white of the paper. So now after I'm finished painting this cast shadow, I did go back in once it was dry and I added a second layer of the same color just because I felt like it wasn't dark enough. I don't show me painting that second layer. I thought I would tell you instead. If you get a dark enough shadow on your first pass and you're content with that, that's great, leave it alone. But if you want to deepen the color, you can always go over it a second time. And you can see I'm going to go in here with a little bit more blue and darken these edges up that are next to the leaf while the cast shadow is still wet. And it's getting a little bit dry up towards the top. So I'll rinse my brush off and wipe it off so that it's just damp, and kind of pull out the paint a little bit so that it doesn't dry with a hard edge. And I'm dropping in a little bit of burnt sienna on this bottom part of the cast shadow. And I'm warming that up with a little bit of the Cad Orange too. And for the last part of the cast shadow, I'm going to be very careful while I paint the cast shadow for the stem. And you don't have to try to pull a line, you know, in one brush stroke. I find for myself that I always seem to go out of the lines when I do that. So I'm just very carefully pulling the color down a little bit at a time, trying to stay within those lines. I love painting the cast shadows on subjects like this because it really makes the whole thing pop. So I'll go a little bit darker down towards the bottom of this cast shadow because it's closest to the actual stem. So it'll be a little bit darker. And I'm doing as much as I can. Like I said, that's butted right up against the tape. So I won't try to mess with that too much. I'll leave it alone, and when I take the tape off, then I'll clean that area up. And I've got a few more little cast shadows here that I'm going to add in. Okay, so I have let my cast shadow dry. My leaf is completely dry. And I have a rubber pickup. You don't need to use one of these to get the masking fluid off. You can just use your finger. And I'm just very carefully going over, making sure that all of the masking fluid is removed. And you can see how wide these veins are. I mean, the masking fluid did a great job, but the lines are just too wide for me. So now what I have to do is go back in and start adding in some burnt sienna to these areas. And right now what I'm doing is I've just got water on my brush, and I'm trying to soften out some of these hard edges. And I'm realizing at this point that I'm just going to have to go back in with a darker color and do a little bit of cleanup around the edges of the veins, making them narrower. So you can watch me do this. I am going to speed up the video a little bit because this is kind of a little bit of a fiddly process, trying to decide which parts of the vein are going to be lighter and which are going to be darker. And it's just a matter of going in with some light washes of paint and darkening up those areas. So now I'm picking up some more of this Cad Orange and I'm making myself a really vibrant puddle. And what I want to do now is glaze over the top of my leaf. And I do have paint on my brush. It's hard to see in that first pass. But I am painting right over the entire leaf, everything, the veins, and I'm warming everything up with some of this Cad Orange, and you can really see it down towards the bottom, how this glaze is affecting the temperature of the leaf. Glazes are a lot of fun, and it's helping to push back those veins also. It's trying to like integrate the veins more into the leaf, and I don't want them to be the star of the leaf, really. So the glazing will help. It's just a watered down mixture of Cad Orange and a little bit of burnt sienna. And I think I threw a little bit of that Cad Red in there also. And this is a good opportunity too, if you have some areas of the leaf that you want to deepen, and you'll see me do that. I'm going to go in and darken some of the colors in here. It's a perfect time to do that. So my leaf is completely dry, and there's some areas that I felt got too dark. So I have this little scrubby brush, and I've wet it and kind of tapped it off so it's damp. And I'm just going in here and I'm lifting some of the color out. Now you don't have to scrub very hard, and you don't want to because you don't want to damage paper. But you can very lightly pick out some areas to lighten up the color. And if it gets too light, you can always glaze back over with a darker color. And I'm going to do the same thing up here at the top. And this area ends up getting a little bit too light for me at some point. And you don't have to use a scrubby brush. You can use your regular paintbrush to lift areas out also. And this brush was a little bit difficult to get into some of these areas. But I wanted to pull that paint out so that there was enough contrast so that you could really get an idea of this little cast shadow that was being created. So any areas that you feel like got too dark, you can easily lift back out. And I feel like that little spot got too light, so I'm going to go back in with a little bit of burnt sienna and drop a little bit of color back in. So now, my favorite part, even though on this one it's really not as epic as most other paintings when you've got a nice clean border, but we're going to remove the tape, and I'm going to go back in where that stem is at the bottom and clean that up. So I've got a couple of little unfinished edges down here, and it's very easy just to go in and finish those edges off. So I am picking up a little bit of burnt sienna. This is the last pass that I'm going to make on this leaf. And I'm just going in and adding some random textures by dropping in some little dots. And I'm also using kind of a dry brush technique. And I just scrape my brush against the paper and it creates a nice little dry brush, rough texture kind of effect, just to give it a little bit more detail, a little bit more interest. And once I finish adding in these little textures, I am going to call this little leaf done. Thanks for being here and joining me on our autumn leaf adventure. And I will see you very soon, and I hope you enjoyed the tutorial.